So this is my scarf, my final documentation, and I'm really proud of it. And I've got my colourful index, which is there. Now, colour choice wise, I've got several documents which explained my understanding of how I was going to make this. To begin with, I just sort of had the idea of a 3-tone colour system like I had for my data collection. That's because I didn't really know what I wanted to do, but I just had this drive that I needed to do something knitting related. And the conclusion, which is my final bit, is a very different wool to the rest of it. And that's partly because it was sample wool that I just kind of wanted to get rid of. But it equally is a multitude of colours. It's about 3 different colour tones and textures. And I felt that was quite a good way of doing it, especially with my introduction line at the bottom to cast off because I ran out of wool. But I feel it helps to incorporate everything that was said within my essay, referring back to the introduction, discussing how things have changed, how things can change, how things might not change, and topics that came up upon the investigation. And yes, originally this was going to be the only document I handed in alongside with my video. And I think that did work out to begin with, but actually through the process of writing, knitting, reflecting, writing, knitting, reflecting, and going back over it, I quite enjoyed writing my essay. And even when I sat down to write my conclusion, it turned out to be 2 pages, which was really long, and I didn't intend it to be that long at all. But just more stuff, there was more stuff I wanted to talk about, more stuff I wanted to explain where this would go. This document is huge in comparison to what I was expecting to write. And there was still more. I could have probably done another 2 chapters from it. But I feel like the motivation and the drive came through knitting, and I enjoyed that, and it encouraged me to write more and to go back at my computer each day to write the next bit because I wanted to knit the next bit. So this case study grew from a mere observation of my 2nd year illustration and animation students protesting against a peer assessment review of work being displayed on a projector in the studio. And that was where my communities of practice came from, and the idea of using that to either be for or against course structure. And like I said, I didn't really get into that. I got more towards course alignment. But the one thing that particularly surprised me from this case study was the suggestion of inclusivity and really exclusive practices that have come about from this. That was never my initial intention from this case study, to look into inclusivity along the lines of assessment, but it just became quite a huge vital part of it. And I'm aware that my questionnaire and interviews were only 6 students. That is not a reliable case study number. You'd need to do hundreds of students to get a proper figure. But it did concern me that everyone was worried. That became clear. No one had a clear understanding really of what assessment was, and that's what caused worry. But from gathering the data, I did realise I could have some biased opinions without realising. I chose the students pretty much from random. I had a wide range. I had a BAME student, a dyslexic student, a hearing impaired disability student, a mature student, male student, female student. I tried to get a broad range of students. And the questionnaire was, when I got round to it, it was all anonymous. At first it wasn't, because I'd got an email every time one student responded to the email for the questionnaire, but then when I went online it became anonymous. That was fine. I then selected 2 students at random, one 3rd year student and one 2nd year student, not knowing what they had put into the questionnaire to begin with. From the questionnaire I could vaguely guess who was a 3rd year student response and who was a 2nd year student response, but I couldn't tell who wrote what until my interview came by and I got further information. I could roughly work out where student 2 had put in the case study questionnaire because they reflected similar answers in their interview. But this got me slightly concerned about having a biased opinion, because I could see that from the follow-up interview, one of the students in particular had a very big issue on inclusivity, and I think because they were promised one thing in one year and one thing in the next, this caused a disliking to their new tutor. And I'm very much aware some of the responses that the student 2 gave me could be seen as bias because they dislike their tutor. They didn't say as much, but I do feel like there was a bit of push and shove in a sense to that bit, and being a mature student, I worry that that might have influenced some of the answers that I got from that. But as a whole, I think that the confusion behind assessment process is partly to do with the unit documentation, as multiple students had to have several explanations sent to them or described by their peer or friend, or had to have it explained by another tutor so that they got that understanding. And I think that because quite a few students depend on this extra support, that there needs to be some different sort of delivery, either from the set criteria or the feedback, because the delivery level needs to be different for different students. Ways around this could be your reading list that is given to the students. I wonder how many actually do the reading list when you've been given this new project, or whether it's worth giving video examples or even having a creative glossary to be handed to the students when you give them these documents, because some students, especially international students, might not get the terminology used to explain what's going on in this unit document. I'm also aware that when we start a new unit, we tend to almost flood the students with paperwork, and every week that I'm in the studio, if there's a new branch of this unit, there's a sheet that's being given out. And how many students get to see the sheet before the start of the day? How many students actually read the sheet? Do they just think, oh, it's another sheet of paper, I'll read it later? And how many do? How many lose the sheet, for example? So I'm wondering if we gave video documentation as one option, whether more students would watch it the day before the lecture, for example. My final contemplation from this essay was one of the themes addressed, that was tutor input. It could be argued that the second year tutor was much more hands-on and almost too helpful. Were they possibly spoon-feeding their students? I don't think they intended to be if they were, but had they given too much information? And this might then cause the students, when they get to third year and have a new tutor, maybe that is one of the reasons why they particularly struggled. But in a vice versa situation, could it be argued that the third year student needed to offer more input and guidance than they're giving now? Are the tutors of each year within the course aware of how their teaching and guidance can create unconscious standards that the students expect? Like, as a result of getting a high input rate from their tutor in second year, they're aware they're going to get less from their third year tutor, but is it much less than they were expecting? Were they expecting the same amount of support and, to an extent, pastoral care than they got now? Or were they expecting just a little bit less, but really it's a lot less? Where does my role as a graduate teaching aide fit within this? I personally feel that I can only go so far and do so much with the information and data I've unearthed from this case study. Upon reflection, I think there needs to be a whole discussion with the course, the tutors, and even the students, because there is something that needs further discussion. And I think this case study was only the start of it, really, because it started out as a reflection and investigation upon the word assessment and how students feel about it. But really, it developed into something much, much bigger and addressed themes that I didn't even expect to, investigate. And it doesn't just fit with 1 year group alone. I think as a result of this investigation, I would further develop my findings into looking deeper at UCA's policy on inclusivity and how that links to assessment. So I worry that students who fall under the disability category feel underrepresented and, to an extent, have become silenced by unconsciously exclusive practices within the studio. For example, take the situation that happened with student B. They had difficulty in the video conferencing style teaching that happened because of COVID-19. However, this was exactly the situation that student 2 wanted rather than coming into university. But it was only through both the students talking that we discovered what their preferences were. And my worry is that we had to wait for these students to speak out to be able to tell us that they needed this help. So we should really be asking ourselves this question: how do we create a safe space environment where students feel comfortable enough to speak out? And there's probably an inclusive answer that can be put into place fairly easily, which would suit student B's needs, and also student 2's needs. But why do we have to wait for the student to come out and say something first? We should be encouraging practices that fit everybody's needs. But does the student know if they have a right to request a different way of teaching, or do they feel that the implication is they receive this education in one way and one way only, and it's the way the tutor teaches? So I think to aid this question, the university needs to consider how we inform students about what methods and practices we can use that are inclusive, and what is available to them for key tasks and performances that are set on the course for their assessment. So I know that a student can access the university's policies and procedures online, especially from their webpage and everything, and they can read what alternatives there are and, how they go about this. That's fine. But how many students are actually going to do that? If you take a quick glance at the inclusive policy document on MyUCA, which isn't called Inclusive Practices, it's called A Policy for Making Adjustments to Assessment Tasks for Students with a Disability or Specific Learning Difference. So it's quite a mouthful to begin with. From clicking on this document, I discovered it had 13 pages. That's a lot of pages, and only 2 of them had a diagram in it. So it's full-on block text. Although it is subcategorised and numbered, it's still 13 pages. Being a dyslexic/dyspraxic myself, seeing that there's 13 pages, that's going to take me probably an hour minimum to read that. And I'm quite a fast reader. Well, for me, I'm quite a fast reader. And that would be quite a terrifying thing to have to look into, to then be able to not only read it and take time to read it, but to read it, to understand it, to retain the information, and then to have to go to my tutor afterwards and propose an alternative to my learning that I might not even really know that's available, and request a different way of learning. That's a huge hurdle to overcome, and the first thing I've got to do is read, which is probably not my confident point to begin with. So how many students see that it's a 13-page document and stop at the first hurdle and just go, you know what, I'll muddle along, it's a simpler way of doing it? You should also probably consider how many students actually would go towards a confrontation style proposal. That is quite a big thing to address, a hierarchy in a studio, which we try not to have a hierarchy. It's not meant to be that. It's meant to be a place of learning. It's meant to be, open. But to an extent, you've still got a student telling a tutor they want something different from their outcome. And that is a huge thing to ask as well. So the way I'd take this case study forward is I'd want the university to address that there needs to be a different place for students to have an inclusive discussion, as it were. And it's not necessarily with just this course, it's the whole universities as a whole. Because it's one thing to go, yeah, just look it online, that's fine. But like I said, how many students actually do that? How many students read policies that are out there? If there was a space, and a regular one that was open, either a physical space or a virtual space, that students could address what they are concerned about, and their tutors could discuss possible practices or methods that are different, and it could just be discussed without fear of judgment or criticism. Perhaps students would feel much more comfortable as a whole to speak up when they're confused about something like assessment. This is the final outcome, which is really long. It's about 5'7" now, and this is the end. It goes all the way through to still going to here. And the last thing I did last night was I knitted a little pocket that has Q&A on it for quality assurance, and I made it so that my little graduation bear from when I graduated from UCF Arnhem can fit inside it, so he can be my quality checker, as it were, for quality assurance. But yeah, I'm really proud of what I've done. I can't stop smiling at it. It's a really lovely scarf, and it came initially from my data experiment, which you can see here. And if I do the example of how long it is, my data runs to, okay, not too bad, just over the first point. So it does my index, as it were, which was my colour code, all the way to end of point 1. So not too bad, but it is still about 3 or 4 times longer than the initial data check that I did. But I'm really proud of my efforts and what I've done. And this morning I ironed it. I don't iron anything. I absolutely hate ironing. I can't deal with it. My head doesn't like ironing. And when I was ironing this scarf, I ironed it flat so that it was all the way straight. And I don't normally iron my knitting when I do, because I just think, well, there's no point in it. If I can avoid ironing, I will. And what I did was I ironed it with a damp cloth to make it flat. And then I sat, and all the little ends I had, which you could see before, where I'd taken off one colour and started the next one, I stitched that to make a seam. And then when that was done, I washed it, because I wanted to make sure it was all kind of fluffy, because some of the wool I've got has been different types of wool, so it was a bit fluffy and scraggly in some areas on the ends. And when that was all done, I then ironed it again, and I flat pressed it properly along the seam so that it would become one nice long thing. And it's colourful, it's vibrant, which is always a great thing for me, and it's something that you would notice. So it looks handmade, so you'd be like, oh, why did you choose those colours? Because there are some points when it goes a bit odd. You've got like a green and a light green. Would you put those two together? But then would you put this colour tone of purple in together? So it gives you a talking point to have. And when I was ironing it all out and everything, I thought, this is like when you refine an essay. I'd written my essay, and it had the scraggly bits on the end. It was twice the size it needed to be, but it wasn't thick enough, whereas this is now thick and pristine looking. So stitching it, ironing it, pressing it, for me it was all the things that I needed to do to fine-tune my essay. So something I should probably point out is I have never been this excited about an essay before. Don't get me wrong, I enjoyed my dissertation when I wrote it at degree level, really enjoyed that, but I didn't get excited by the prospect of writing it. I just kind of wrote it in bits and then went back to it and back to it and back to it. Whereas with this essay, but for this I felt really motivated, because I knew that once I'd done this one section, I could then knit it, and knitting is something I find really enjoyable. And through this process, I then felt like I learned more from what I wrote, because I was then knitting it. And in the process of that, I got encouraged and almost excited to start the next point the following day, to then be like, oh, okay, I'll knit the next bit, I'll knit the next bit. And I was very much aware that this essay could have gone on. There was a huge section that I wanted to look into on communities of practice from a negative outlook, because there are points I've noticed in the studio where students aren't keen on doing group work or mixing with another course. There was a point where last term the illustration and animation group mixed with graphic design up the corridor, and there was a real push boundary type bit for them where they couldn't quite accept the idea of joining another group, of joining people they didn't know, doing group work, and it was a real struggle for the first day for the students to get their head around that aspect of sharing their ideas with another community, as it were. And by the second day, things turned out quite alright for most groups, and there were some lovely final outputs that came from that spatial practice day. But it's that first bit that I really wanted to delve into, and I had some responses from my questionnaires and from the 2 interviews I had about group work and how students felt that group work would depend on their overall assessment, because in group work you sometimes have to divide the marks between how many there are of you, and do you go equally because that's fair and you've all worked on it, or do you stick your head above the water and go, actually I put more into this than someone else, so I feel I should get a grade from it, high mark kind of thing. So there was a huge section I wanted to look onto that, but I just realised there wasn't enough time, and this topic slightly went further away from the idea of assessment and more into communities of practice. So I didn't feature that within my essay, which was a shame, but I could just see this could go on for so long, and it was only because I was knitting it that I realised just how long this whole document was. I wasn't really paying attention to the page count at the bottom of the page because I just went, oh yeah, it's more words kind of thing. And by taking it chapter by chapter, topic by topic kind of thing, I felt more confident because I thought, oh, it's only 3 pages, I can do that, no problem, I can write that in a day, I can do this. So that was a really interesting aspect for me to then, at the end of the whole essay, to put it all together and go, oh, actually, this is huge, this is really big. And I, don't get me wrong, I am super proud of what I've produced, but I am more proud of the fact that I knitted a scarf, which seems stupid because knitting is just something I do as a hobby and it's something I really enjoy. But to go, oh, actually, I've translated this Word document into a scarf makes me more proud because it's more creative than just writing an essay for me. I feel like I've grown quite a lot from the PG Cert as a whole. I've discussed theories and practices that I didn't know existed, and then I've equally experimented and used theories that I knew of, but I didn't know what they were, as it were. And it's made me reflect on my teaching as a whole, and I feel that I'm a lot more inclusive. That has been the huge part for me of this course. And I think it's because I struggle with my dyslexia and dyspraxia at times that I was really appreciative of my disability support tutor when I was at university 3-4 years ago. And now I've gone through a much more theoretical styled course. Without that aid, I've had to really do a lot myself, which didn't imply that I didn't do it myself before, but I had to refer back to the practices I used to use, which I haven't used in a couple of years because I haven't had to write a full-on essay or anything like that. And it's made me reflect on my own practices and think about things a lot more, and if I'm struggling, how does another student feel? That is why, if I could take this investigation further, I would look further into the university's Inclusivity Act and its policies, because it's good, it's better than other universities, but I still feel like there could be more, just from what students have said, and especially if we have to do things like online learning in case anything happens again. How do we put other things in place for those students who that doesn't work for? What is an alternative? How do we make everyone still feel included and part of a connected community without it sacrificing something else that we feel is important?